She looks good for 13.
She does. It's amazing. She had a buddy until last August, not this one, but the one before, who moved on to dog heaven and at age 12. So we feel like we're on borrowed time with her, but she's healthy and spunky.
Good. Good to hear. All right, we live, Haley?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So this meeting will now come to order on December 12th, 2022 of the City of Asheville Noise Advisory Board. My name is Jessica Thomason. I'm the chair of the board. I will introduce each agenda item and facilitate the meeting to help our audience follow along. All committee members and staff are participating virtually today. We are streaming live on our virtual engagement hub, which is accessible through the virtual engagement hub link on the front page of the city website and also linked on the Noise Advisory Board page. For those of you that are out there with us today, welcome. I will now go ahead and go through and introduce all the board members who are participating virtually and staff members. Please make sure to mute your microphone if you are not speaking. When you have a question or would like to speak, please unmute your microphone. Board members and staff, as I call your name, please acknowledge your presence. Rick Freeman.
Here.
Reb Hazlett.
Here.
Liliana Woody.
Here.
Carmelo Pompolonio. Not present. Jeff Santiago. Jeff.
Here.
Okay, I saw you join. Councilwoman Antoinette Mosley.
Hello.
And Noise Administrator Todd Justice.
Hello.
Thank you all for being with us today. Is there anybody else that I missed that's on the call with us, Haley? Okay. All right, so the meeting is called to order.
You did get Dave, right?
I did.
Okay, awesome.
And with that, our first order of business is the introduction to our new board member, David Ledger.
Hello.
David, nice to meet you. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I have an automotive background. So I worked in Detroit for about 4 years in noise and vibration for OEM. And I did a lot of work at a test track in Australia for about 4 years, doing pass-by noise and a lot of hybrid vehicle development inside the vehicle and outside. And I still work in automotive, more in component refinement and sound quality. And I have 2 rescue dogs and live here in the city of Asheville. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. And always nice to have, I don't know if you're from Detroit originally, but I'm from Detroit. And I worked in the automotive industry before moving to Asheville 23 years ago. So welcome. All right, so our next order of business is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting. There is a link in the agenda to that. Hopefully everyone had an opportunity to take a look at that. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting?
A motion to approve.
Reb motions to approve. Thank you. Can I get a second, please?
I could second that.
Jeff seconds. Thank you. Rest of the board members, Rick, can I get a motion to pass or fail?
Pass.
Thank you. Liliana?
Pass.
Thank you. David?
Pass.
And pass for me. So the minutes of our last meeting have been approved. Moving on. So we didn't meet last month, but we do have a staff report from November and one from December. So looking at November 1st, does anybody on the board have any questions for city staff in regards to the November staff report? No? Okay. What about the December report? Does anybody have any questions for city staff on the December report? Rick has his hand raised. Rick, you have a question?
A suggestion.
Sure.
Now that we've been at this for more than a year, I think the report would help if we were seeing a summary of how the previous month compares to the month a year before. You know, so we're kind of seeing month over month. How did we do in September of 21? How does that compare to September of 22? So we can kind of just see, you know, is it all staying the same number of complaints, same breakdown? I think that would, in a summary somewhere, that would just make it real easy to see if we're moving the needle, especially with some of the proposals we're going to make and recommendations if they're accepted by city council. We expect to see fewer of those kinds of, well, maybe a lot. We eventually expect to see fewer of those kinds of complaints and citations if our proposals work.
So I can speak to that just a little bit. Staff are currently working on our 2023 noise log and dash templates. And what we have drawn up so far would show a month to month and year to year. You'd be able to make those comparisons easily.
Okay, great.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Haley. Can I ask a question on that just real quick? Is there, because this is something that came up in our retreat that I had not thought of. I think it was Carmelo who brought it up, was that it would be interesting. Is there any data included in that in terms of population growth from one year to the next that'll be included as part of that? Just out of curiosity of just.
We hadn't planned for that, but it shouldn't be too difficult to, gather that information once it's posted. Trying to think of what organization posts that population growth data. But we'll figure it out.
Okay. That would be great, just out of curiosity, just to making sure, we're actually getting all of that information is looking at percentages wise.
Yeah, that makes sense. Remind me at our next agenda setting meeting, and I'll dig into that for you.
Okay. And I'm happy to look in to see if I can't find any of that information too.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
just in terms of like you said, like who's actually tracking that data.
Mm-hmm. Between the two of us, I'm sure we'll figure it out.
I think so. Any other questions about staff reports from November or December before we move on? Okay, moving on to old business. Working group updates, which I'm glad we're just moving right along and getting to this. So first, we're going to talk about the decibel levels and the survey responses, and that's going to be handled by Rick and Jeff.
So you all have the link that Haley put together that has the redacted both written survey results from the email survey and Jeff's collection of the phone call survey results. Does anybody have any questions on that before either Jeff or I make editorial comments about what we think we've learned?
I have a couple questions. So I went through all of them, and some of them are really obvious of, they state who the complaint was, they had an issue with. And some of them were a little unclear since, and I know part of that's probably happened with redacting some of the information. So to keep it private. So I wondered if there was, so my first question is like, was some of this cross-referenced with the reports from the date of the complaint that each person made, just to?
No.
Okay.
No, I didn't want to make, I just wanted to present the content exactly as delivered by the complainant, and I think that question is appropriate for what we would do as next steps.
Okay, great. So yeah, so that's I'd love to hear what your findings were, and then we can talk through it.
Okay. Jeff, do you want to say anything first, or you're on mute, buddy?
You can go ahead and start, and I can jump in.
So I think my general takeaway is there's probably one next step that I think that's important. I think that, and I've talked to Todd about this, and even without taking it to City Council, he's agreed that we can make an effort with these locations where there continuous is complaints and where the content of their survey result is an implication in that they're losing the ability to use parts of their homes and things like that, to go out there and to take both the traditional DBA measures, which is what the ordinance currently calls for, but equally important, it's time to start to collect low frequency sound data, or DBC as it's typically called, since you will see in several of the reports, including public input we just received like today, the complainant says, hey, I live in this location and I'm surrounded by clubs, and most of the time I really like it, but sometimes they switch over to really loud decibel, low frequency stuff that literally shakes my windows and doors and I just can't sleep. And when the ordinance was created, we looked for, this would be 19 and 20, we looked for good examples of low frequency components in ordinances, but we kind of came up short. And we at least talked about at that time that we should start to take data and see what we're learning. And so I talked to Todd, and he thinks that we can plan and organize this such that we do two things. We go to all the complainants who agreed that they would support measurements being made on their property, both inside and outside. And we go there when there is no source of continuous noise or that they're bothered with, to take baseline data, both on the A scale and the C scale, to sort of establish, what does it sound like on a typical late spring evening? And then we take measurements again when the sound source is active, and collect that stuff and then try to make some analysis of that. My hope is two-part. One, that we would get some DBC stuff that we could pin our hat on to make a future recommendation about revised DBC numbers that we thought could be managed. And two, if we take measurements inside these properties where the complainants are saying, I can't listen to my TV, we'll get some actual objective data. And there's a bunch of common sense scales. All you got to do is look up decibel scales, and you'll get 100 pictures that show what a typical sound is at 40 decibels and 50 decibels and 60 decibels. And I think we'll find that some places are really losing access to their property as a result of that, or a room or a patio. And in some cases, we'll find that the complainant just doesn't want to hear it at all, and it's down there at a whisper. And I think that will help, because there's kind of two factions, is too strong of a word, two different camps. One camp is that these are just repeat complainers and they would complain about anything, and it's all subjective. And the other camp is, all this noise is way too much, and you're ruining the value of my home. And by being able to take fair measurements with city staff who are qualified users of those tools, hopefully we can come back with some actual measurements that say, here's what we found on these circumstances and these properties. And then we face the difficult decision at that point in time about whether that would lead to a recommendation in decibel level changes in the ordinance. So that's my feeling of where they are. I mean, it breaks my heart to read some of these responses about, people just feel like they need to leave Asheville. And when the music is going to be going loud from various outdoor places or those kinds of things. I have a hard time not thinking that isn't an example of hurting the livability of the community. And I just think we need to work together to find a more objective way to portray that. I'd love to get feedback or questions, or Jeff, maybe you add some on top.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning both those camps, if you will, because it is a line we need to be able to figure out and find the proper balance that makes sense for everyone. I do want to mention it's a lot of other things on that list of complaints that we did receive and that we did work through were other consistent factors besides those things you mentioned, including the trouble we see over at for protesters over at Planned Parenthood and other such things like that. So I just want to make sure we're covering the whole scope of what's affecting our community noise-wise. It's important that we're looking at the big picture of that, and that's all I really wanted to add to that.
Other questions? Thoughts?
So, yeah, okay. So based on that, I have a couple questions. One is for Todd too. So I was under the impression that it was hard for the city to measure DBC, and that was one of the reasons why we didn't look at including that in the ordinance to begin with. Can you speak to that, Todd, as to, is it the issue of being inside people's houses that was, or can you just explain to me what that is?
So to my understanding from talking to Daniel about this is that in order to get an accurate sea level reading, you have to establish a baseline. He described it as we would have to go into this person's home, wherever they want us to measure from, and then have them turn the HVAC off and anything else that might be creating levels of noise that maybe even aren't that obvious to the average human ear, so to speak. And get that baseline reading so that when the noise that they're complaining about happens again or occurs again, we would then go out and make another measurement, and essentially the C reading that we would get at that point would be the difference in what the reading was at base and then what it is when they're complaining about the level of noise. And so, yes, that requires two things. One, it requires permission to be on the property. And then two, it requires that we be on the property multiple times in order to make an accurate assessment. And so, and then we have the problem of how do we enforce something that's based on sea level without having all that data already in place. So, I mean, it would have to be understood, it would have to be in the ordinance that in order for us to pursue a complaint based on those levels, that there's going to have to be some work and some time, and it's not going to be just Daniel going out and citing somebody or sending a contact letter or whatever. In order for us to determine whether there's been a violation or not, we would have to go through this whole kind of measuring and investigating process in order to do that.
Gotcha. But it's feasible to do that, like in regards to what?
It's feasible, sure.
Okay. And then just again to my first question is, it would be good to cross-reference some of these survey responses, because part of my question was like, I was having a hard time getting a full picture from it, and I went through the ones that before, the ones I had access to that before they were redacted to see if I couldn't get a little bit more information as to like where some of the complaints were. Again, some of them were pretty easy to follow because they mentioned the business. Like one of them I wasn't sure of until I looked at the staff report and saw Rendezvous, for instance. And I was like, oh, that's the bocce ball one, But it would be interesting to cross-reference to see if some of these complaints were from like early 2021, for instance. First, like it would be interesting to see what the time frame of some of these things were, just to be able to see, like, you know, especially ones that said like the noise team didn't come out or anything like that, to see if there was actually measurements that were taken so that we could sort of A/B some of the information that was here. It just would be good to know that. And then the other part of that is what I got is like one of the things that this definitely, again, just reinforces how complicated of an issue that this is that we're trying to figure out, because complainant number 11 brings up that something may not even reach 65 dB and it's still thought of as noise. And it's like, you know, again, we're tasked with this very complicated situation of how do we deal with things like that? Because, and especially from that other comment that we got from public comments, which sounded like it may even be from the same person, but it's, I mean, they make a valid point, right? And it's interesting when you think about the fact of like, you know, it may be within the range, but, you know, there's certain things that might be really just hard to listen to at, you know, over and over and over again. And it's interesting is because I think that the point that maybe this place or the other person brought up was also in a public setting like Pack Square, which I know is something that is a continued issue, right? Of just between street preachers and buskers and car noise and all those sort of things. So it's that's definitely one of the things that I looked at from, I took away from your survey results was, you know, we're still dealing with a very complicated issue of what is noise and what isn't noise, as pointed out by some folks.
Yeah, so those are really good points. We have, you know, newer board members. I would ask the newer board members to think whether they'd like to participate in this, because the next phase is a lot more work than what we've done so far. And the kinds of things you pointed out, Jessica, I think are important for the decibel working group to say, hey, it's not just decibels, it's how often this noise comes. You know, like on the public input today on that one, it's not that the one drummer, you know, drums so incredibly loud for 5 minutes that they can't stand it. It's that it's just this repetitive bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, and it goes on and on and on. And that's kind of gotta come out of the decibel working group and go into, if there is a working group that's looking at public space noise, which is the pure nuisance thing, right? Nobody measures the decibels of a busker. That's where I think the enforcement guys both have a lot of flexibility and get driven insane, right? Because now it's a judgment call on their behalf based on what they hear and their experience, whether that particular source is annoying because it's incredibly loud, or it's annoying for any of the other reasons that public input has given. And I know when this was written, you know, working with Ben Woody, he wanted that flexibility because you can't legislate every possible combination of repetitiveness and location and level. You have to be able to make judgments on whether that's noise. And I'm sure that even allowing that to stay in the ordinance was a pain for the city attorney, because if it actually gets all the way to that point, it's difficult. But almost all of the other North Carolina ordinances always have a nuisance clause as well, where public input, as interpreted by compliance, makes a decision that this is annoying. That'd be too much for this working group to handle. And I think we need maybe another working group that stuff can be handed off to. We sort of stay pure on complaints from the public that the allowable decibels and the allowable frequency of decibels they consider to currently be ineffective. And we have to try to collect objective data to either prove that that's true or disprove it.
If I might add to that, and this is just some sort of suggestion in the idea of something to consider, which is also very complicated. What if there is some sort of decibel sliding scale based on time? You know, you're talking about noises and levels at particular times of the day. You know, and what are you talking about 8 p.m. on a Friday or 1 a.m.? You know, how do we approach that? Like, how do we make those considerations? So that's just something I wanted to put out there just for thought. That's all.
So I'd like to just offer a add-on to that, Jeff, because I think you're onto something. If anybody was of the mind to study science, we'd find that sound of some level of some time creates stress in the human being, and that stress is what leads to long-term disease, you know, an increase in blood pressure and all that sort of stuff. So if you go all the way back to the World Health Organization stuff, that's kind of what they tried to write up, you know, more than a decade ago. And it would be good if somebody would take the time to look into current thinking about, you know, what level of noise at what time creates different levels of stress. And those stressors, either in some people's case, like our former board member, Charlie, caused him to say, I've had enough. You're never going to solve this problem. I'm going to sell my condo and get the heck out of here. So he found a way to reduce his stress by just avoiding the circumstance. When we take measurements, first we establish a baseline, and then we take them on somebody's patio or inside their living room. We're going to come up with some numbers, and we're still going to end up in the debate whether that number is a true indication of stress placed upon those residents in some way that is not reasonable. Sorry to be so vague, but you know, it's easy to just say it wakes me up, but some people who stay up late, they're still stressed out if there's someone's banging on a bell, or if there's a factory that's pounding on pallets and that sort of thing. And that's ultimately where the judgment should be, I think, or where we could bring some more science and fact to try to get rid of subjectivity, which I think is also what Jeff was recommending.
Gotcha.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah. Hey, Carmelo.
Can you guys? Okay, I didn't know if you guys could hear me. That was the first time I said anything. Yeah, thank you for putting this together. This is extremely fascinating. It's all over the place, and it's hard for me to kind of like propose, any single or concise like method of approach. But I do like Jeff and Rick, what you guys were just talking about with looking into more of a sliding scale meets scientific approach as to how we can best assess this. I mean, it would be much easier if it was only 2 offenders, right? I mean, we all know that. Just saying the easy thing there. Like if it was just like, oh, the people on North Market Street, or oh, just Rabbit. But as far as like putting together some sort of approach to kind of assess everything, I mean, in my head, because these are coming from such an overwhelming amount of sources, perhaps it would be best, this is just one idea, if we focused on maybe like, say, 2 of them for the time being. And if that requires ears on the ground, I know one person at the top of your PDF, I forget what number they are, they might even be number 1 or 2. They were like, come over for coffee or tea. And they emailed you like, hey, now would be a good time. I hear them warming up and doing the rehearsal and everything. I mean, like, would it hurt to do that? No. Might it be a little inconvenient if it's like a surprise thing for any of us who would be, willing to be on call for such a thing? Yeah, potentially. And that's what makes it tricky. But I mean, it seems that the issues with the venues might be kind of garnering the most complaints. No, am I mistaken in thinking that? The other stuff is more general. Like Haley, you sent the one today that was about North Market Street, and they were talking about venues that were, on that back side where all the lawyers' offices are on that side of Broadway. But I mean, it sounds like they're venues nonetheless. And the tricky thing is too, regardless how that's approached, Rick, you're absolutely right that this could definitely, it would be prudent to use like a more scientific approach, if you will, but it gets so complicated when it comes to like measuring this stuff, as so many of these people have pointed out, and as Jessica was kind of getting into and everything. And not to beat a dead horse or do any sort of hand wringing, but like it takes more amplitude for a low frequency sound to be heard than a mid-range or high frequency sound to be heard, generally with the way that our ears are structured. And that's one thing that kind of makes it tricky. But to even throw that even more askew, that can be like totally discarded when it comes to the fact that like, well, you can have low amplitude, low frequencies, but their impact on how they hit the body and how loud and how annoying and how harmful they can be totally changes depending on like, are they coupling with a building's structure, the floors, the windows, anything like that? Like, are they being acoustically muted so you can't hear the frequencies and you're free from the decibels? But are they coupling with some sort of structure that is like, amplifying the physical vibrations, almost like the difference between sound and seismic waves, if that makes sense? So it does become extremely complicated. I think that that's why, Jeff, I like your idea of like looking into what would a sliding scale look like. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like a sliding scale of like a decibel level. I don't have an answer as to what the end result of said sliding scale could be in reference to, but looking into flexible things that account for all these complications is definitely in our best interest. But I mean, taking a broad step back from all of that, these people are complaining about a broad number of sources, and I think it's too much for us to really like look at all of them and try and come up with a game plan that's going to umbrella them all in. It might behoove us to just maybe focus on a few. And given the fact that you two are the ones working on this and have a more intimate understanding of this, perhaps we can talk about, whether now or at a different time, what the top contenders would be if we were to pursue such a path, and what that might look like. Does that mean we're going to go out there and go to someone's property or go to the venues at a certain time, or what that might look like? But I'm just really thinking out loud here to kind of break this down and tackle it in an efficient way,
So I just gave you some feedback. I thought that was really good thinking. One thing that's driven me, I think, courtesy of Jessica being very focused on the broad picture, is to not focus only on music venues. Because then no matter what we find, it runs the risk of, oh, you guys had it out for music venues and that's all you did, and why didn't you pay more attention to this one or that one or the other one? I think the good news is that, and I haven't memorized this, the complaints that were not from music sources can be worked now over a period of time, because the ones that are from outdoor music sources basically need to wait till outdoor music starts again in the spring. So like one was a manufacturer that tears pallets apart or something like that, and and that when they go do that thing, it makes this noise and doesn't have any DVC in it, as best I can tell. Now, we could still do that work if appropriate on that one between now and whenever the outdoor music season looks like it's getting ready. And that's pretty easy to tell because we'll be able to see when the outdoor music venues are advertising that they're starting up and when the bands are going to come to town and all that sort of thing. And of course, now we can also go take bass lines inside and outside. But you guys all know, because I think I've preached this before, that this time of year, no leaves means the sound doesn't get knocked down by trees. But so you might think, well, it's going to feel louder, but on the other hand, it's cold out, and sound travels less well in low temperatures of low humidity than it does in high temperatures of high humidity. So those are all the complexities that we're going to need to document during these measurement efforts, so that whatever...
I'm sorry, Rick, I lost your signal. I'm really sorry. I lost your signal for a second. You just when you cut out about the leaves, and you said something about the temperature too.
Yeah, so sound travels farther and faster in high temperature, high humidity than it does in cold, dense. So even if we try to do a baseline now, it's only a baseline for wintertime. It's not a baseline at that location for summer. But, you know, that's okay. We start somewhere and see what the differences are over time.
Going with the scientific approach, it travels faster in humid weather, but further in cold weather. So there's the double-edged sword with that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's extremely complicated. I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah.
It's okay. So anyway, I think we're not about to make a recommendation to City Council to do any particular thing. I'm looking for support from the board to take the input we've all had today, what we've got, support from Todd, and sort of start trying to lay in a plan where measurements could be taken to establish these baselines and to teach us something. And I don't know if that needs a vote or just any negative feedback that people feel like this is either not in scope for the Noise Advisory Board to do that, or yeah, let's go see.
Can I ask a question, make a suggestion? I think all of this is well in line with the Noise Advisory Board. I think one of the things I want to point out is that the survey that the city had initially did about noise in complaints was one of the most heavily accessed in the community in terms of, I remember that being said, of the amount of engagement that they had from the community was one of the largest that they've had when doing a citywide survey. And so I think, and to that point, it was one of the reasons why I was like, let's not just focus on the venues, because music was seventh on that list, right? So there was a lot of other concerns from community members. So would it be advantageous of us to do a larger survey, get a larger base other than just the folks that you all have reached out to send that out to see how the rest of the community feels in terms of where things are at? Because it may behoove us to do that to get a bigger sample size, one, and two, to see if there's other things that we're missing as well from that data, from the amount of engagement that the city had originally on this topic.
So that came up in the retreat, and I think it was an action item to do a broad survey, which we'll have to delegate to city communication staff. The only reason we were allowed to do this survey is because it was narrow. And it
Gotcha.
was very specific on, hey, you complained, it was found to be no violation, and you were willing to share your your contact information. And even at that, we only ended up with about half the people who replied to very pointed questions.
Mhm.
So,
Gotcha.
you know, I'm personally, I'm okay with the broader survey. I'm just not going to raise my hand to go work that out with Kate.
Totally understand. I totally understand that.
So with lack of any other input, if any of the other board members would like to participate in this working group, they can contact me and let me know. And in the meantime, if no one else does, we'll go along at whatever pace Jeff and I have to work with Todd and to, you know, hypothetically come back to you guys with, instead of just a aim in a particular direction, a particular A, B, and C, and D, and E step that would be part of what we would do as follow up. And I would further say that we would inform City Council in our annual report that this is what we're doing as it relates to evaluating the effectiveness of the decibel limits that are in the system, and that we are going to take some DVC data to see if there's something there that we would come back with as a recommendation at a future time.
Okay. And I'm happy to help. I know it's a lot of work, this working group, so I'm happy to jump in and help you all.
Okay, that's it for me then.
Jeff, you have
More
anything
than my
else to add?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered it. You know, it's a lot to figure out. So hopefully we can get some direction on it, like Rick says. So.
Okay, great. Moving on to old business, we have vehicle noise. And Reb, do you have any update for us on that working group?
I do. I'm pleased to say I don't think it's as thorny an issue as what you just were working with. This seems to be fairly straightforward. In fact, I sent an email to Haley this morning. I'm not sure if that was distributed or not, to make a recommendation, and I'll go into the details of this, but to make a recommendation that the NAB go ahead and ask City Council to direct the city manager to ask the NAB to effect changes in the noise ordinance that would reduce or place prohibitions on intentional vehicular noise having to do with revving, modified exhaust systems, motorcycle, straight pipes and the like. It turns out it's a pretty universal problem in our research. This is a problem all across the country, and there's a tremendous amount of precedent in ordinances that are already written in sound level restrictions and a number of means and methods used to combat vehicular noise. There's Haley put that up, but the first paragraph really is our task force recommendation to NAB. Turns out that noise is 5%, or rather vehicular noise represents about 5% of the cumulative number of complaints made on a monthly or annual basis. It also turns out that the City of Asheville Police Department does in fact currently enforce the two provisions in the ordinance that deal with vehicular noise, and that is basically broken mufflers, unmuffled vehicles, and engine braking. And I had a conversation with Captain Mike Lamb of the APD about that, and he did verify that they currently police that, with the caveat that they're understaffed. They don't really have the resources. They can't do an effective job at policing those sorts of things, but it falls naturally under their purview because it's largely moving vehicle, and it's not something that on an enforcement basis can be done very well by our group. But the Captain Lamb, when I explained what we were looking at, was supportive of the idea of placing further restrictions on vehicular noise, particularly in the CBD. Having said that, there'd be a lot of work that we would have to do, the NAB would have to do in consultation with APD to find out what compliance and enforcement would look like. But he was encouraging. And Todd, I did try and circle back to Mike Lamb several times after our last conversation. You pointed out that those two provisions in the code are all they do. I was not able to get back to him, but I was still impressed with his encouragement to pursue this previously. What Haley has got up right now is several precedents from ordinances in both Greenville and Knoxville. I have spoken to individuals in city government in both of those communities. They're both battling noise in their downtown. Greenville has been fairly aggressive about it. They both have very simple provisions in their ordinances to prohibit that. They have the same problems with enforcement as most small communities in terms of resources and staffing, but they do have good language that protects against it. Ironically and interestingly, the sound level limits that are in our current ordinance really should give the police department effective enforcement against these. But I think that we could strengthen the language of our ordinance to target these specifically. There's a real problem in the CBD and downtown with cruising, with revving, with motorcycles that are keeping people up at late, disturbing diners at dinner, and so on and so forth. And so Rick is on the committee. Jeff Fromson, who lives in Aris downtown, is on the committee, and we felt like it was a pretty easy call to say we should ask to look at this. We should ask council to authorize the manager to have us look at this. So I don't know if that's a vote from NAB to put this in its end of year report. If that's what's necessary, that's what I would call for. But I think it would be the next step and certainly the recommendation of this committee. Kind of where we got to. I think as Todd described the vehicular noise problem, it's low-hanging fruit. It's having been involved in the CAN drafting of the original ordinance, and Rick helped me out here. I don't think we really dealt with this. I think in many ways it's almost an oversight that there's not language in here that prevents this sort of behavior that is so disruptive on downtown streets and other parts of the city.
I recall at one point in the CAN draft, we had plagiarized another ordinance that actually specified decibel levels at a certain number of feet from the roadside and that sort of thing. And I think it just got, I think we got overruled when people said the state already dictates the law as it relates to jake braking and all that sort of stuff. And so we thought that there were other problems that were bigger to solve, and we paid, or whatever the case is, we tried saying, hey, take that out, but put this in, typical negotiation and try to get something over the line.
Well, we do have jake braking in our current ordinance. And really the main challenge of including this language is that APD won't be any less stressed if we do it. Enforcement won't be any less difficult if we do it. It just creates the provisions for perhaps the point in the future where the Asheville Police Department is reinforced and can take on some of the efforts that they have in the past.
So I'll make one more comment, then I think I really want to hear from everybody else. Having never written a recommendation to city council out of a board or commission of any kind, if the language that Reb has come up with, which I reviewed yesterday and I thought it looked pretty good, if that's an acceptable form and adequate detail to set forth to city council and have them discuss it and push back on us if they think we've lost our minds or whatever the case is, then I'd be happy to vote yes to go today. if the board wants to read it, other than when they're sitting in front of their computer right now, then we need to have another meeting early enough in January so that feedback can tune it up and we can make sure it makes it into the document, because we could miss that date and still make a recommendation, but I think it's most effective if we're telling a thorough story on the 3 or 4 things we're really working on. And, the one I just got done talking about is, hey, City Council, this is what we're working on. We're not asking you to give direction to anybody because Todd agreed that this is within scope of his responsibility as it is. But writing the ordinance language always would have to go through City Council. So either today, from my perspective, I'd vote yes, or if people want to wordsmith it to make it even more impactful to City Council, then we need to meet next month before our deadline.
And so this is the first time I've seen it, so I haven't had a chance to read through it. There's recommendations in terms of rewriting the noise ordinance for this part, correct? Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, I'd love to take a look at that and just become more familiar with it before voting on it. So I would say let's look at, which we'll talk about here shortly, is meeting in January to see if we can't get everybody on the same page and then get that into the annual report that's due on the 21st of January. So that's my call. I don't know what anybody else thinks.
I agree with you. I'd like
The
to
only, sorry, Liana, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'd like to read it through. So if there is a question, I feel comfortable after I've read it and I can answer it reasonably.
I'd like to maybe make a recommendation that feedback comes from the board if they have any, at least a week before our next meeting or 5 days before our next meeting, so that Reb and the team would have time to take that feedback and tune it up. So it would go for a vote, so we don't end up with a bunch of live feedback and then we miss the deadline on the 21st for submitting our annual report.
Sure. That seems reasonable. Absolutely.
I agree.
So we'll make a point if we, when we get into talking about the meeting for January today, that we set a deadline to get questions to you, Reb, 5 days before that, or 7 days before, whatever makes sense in terms of giving you enough time to answer any questions that we have or recommendations.
That's good. It was not necessarily written as a draft of the recommendation to City Council.
Oh, okay. It's not.
I mean, there's one paragraph that's the recommendation. It's the first paragraph, really.
Okay.
The rest is background information for your sake.
Okay,
So
great.
that you can understand what some of our research has borne.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for putting that together.
I have a quick clarifying question, if that's okay. Oh, go ahead, Haley. You raised your hand.
I was just going to let everybody know that this morning I put this meeting document or this document with the meeting documents folder. So if you need to find access to a copy, it is with the meeting documents, and just reach out to me if you've misplaced that link and I'll be happy to resend.
I have a question. It seems to me everyone from the board should give some response one way or the other, that they at least have read it and it's good, so that whomever's in charge here knows that we're all on the same page, that we've read it.
Yeah,
Am I
great
hearing
idea.
that correctly? Yeah.
And as far as that goes, what might be a good idea is once you've read it, email just Reb and Jessica, and that way Jessica can keep track of who's read it, and Reb can get your feedback directly to incorporate. And that won't cause a quorum because it'll just be those 3 members involved in the conversation.
Okay, Carmelo, you were about to say something?
Yeah, I just had a quick clarifying question for you, Reb. It looks like I mean, I like how you're looking at the models from different states. I looked at the other states too after our conversation in person the other month. It feels like forever ago. I can't even remember what month that was, maybe October. And it's like, for an example, we're kind of like smack dab in the middle with our decibel levels between like New York and California, just as an example of two, highly populated states, as far as like the vehicle decibels. Or actually, no, I'm sorry, I misread that. You gave the example of decibel levels for Knoxville. Those levels are smack dab between California and New York on the whole. But looking at that, you have 3 points here, and it's the language around engine revving, the decibels for it, and then cruising, which is a little bit different. And I'm not really so much concerned about, my question's not directed towards that, but like the language about it makes total sense. And I think that something can definitely be crafted around that. 100%. I'm just curious, and forgive me if I'm missing a piece of the puzzle that's already been put on the table here. How do those decibel levels get read and enforced in like a live setting, because the officers don't have the dB meters.
Well, that's the $64,000 question, really. And it raises probably one of the big discussions relative to the ordinance overall, and that is the degree of subjectivity allowed in enforcement. Would we be willing to allow APD to make an on-the-ground assessment that it's just too loud by subjective assessment? If you're standing next to a motorcycle, it's not too hard to tell that it's 120, 150 decibels. So there is it is in the Knoxville ordinance, there's additional language that's very clear that an officer can interpret a sound to issue a warning or a citation without necessarily having to have a measuring device. And I think if you read what I wrote, part of the next step, if the council if we were authorized or empowered to research this part of the ordinance, we would definitely have to consult with APD. I mean, we're going to have some serious conversations with APD about what they're willing to do, what they're able to do, both now and in the future. And I think, Todd can talk a little bit to subjectivity. We've talked about this somewhat. You've almost got to grant some level of on-the-ground discretion as to what constitutes too much noise. Otherwise, you can't really enforcement. APD just can't enforcement. So that's just a conversation we'll have to have moving forward as we determine how to construct this thing, if that's what y'all think's in the best interest.
Let me clarify some things a little bit. So the only thing that deals with this subject that's actually written, hard-coded into the general statute are the things we've already talked about, which are the straight pipe mufflers and the vehicle without a muffler and the jake braking. And so when the comment was made earlier that, somebody kind of wiggled out of this being put into the ordinance because those were the only things that were, actually in the general statute, that's true, but it's kind of a half truth. Everything that 90% of what I do is based on a nuisance ordinance. And the only thing that the general statute says is that local governments can define what a nuisance is. So that's why if you go down to Wilmington, you're going to get, trash and debris. You're going to get a definition of trash and debris. Down there, you're going to get a definition of what noise is, what noise nuisance is. And then you go to Charlotte, you're going to get a different definition. You go to Raleigh, you're going to get a different definition. But all those definitions are fairly similar because they have survived the scrutiny of the courts over the years. And so, quite honestly, I would stay away from anything that is a finite definition of what you think a nuisance noise is in relation to vehicles. And you make it as subjective as possible, because then the police officer who's there on the ground, he's the one that's going to be writing the citation. He's the one that's going to be stopping the vehicle. He's the one that's going to be engaging with the violator. And 99 times out of 100, any court is going to support what that officer deemed to be unreasonable at the time. And the only reason that the law enforcement officer is having to do it, and I've said this before, that my guys can't do it, is because they're the only ones that are authorized to stop a motor vehicle on the state highway. So I don't think you need to go into decibel levels. I don't think you need to try to define exactly what a particular level of noise is reasonable or unreasonable. You make it subjective, and it's the officer's call there on the ground, and they know what they can articulate. If it were 999 times, it's never going to go to court. It's never going to go in front of a magistrate or anything else. Honestly, it comes back on the city to pursue that person if they don't pay the fine, because we're talking about a civil citation, which is essentially a parking ticket. And it falls back on the city to, pursue that if they don't pay the fine. So, but what it does is it puts the presence out there. It puts the ordinance out there. We can do like Greenville and put signs on every corner that, we're just not going to tolerate that level of noise or whatever. And I think that will go very far towards alleviating the problem. Towards, it's not going to end up in court. So that's just all I wanted to add there. We define what a nuisance is. The city does in its ordinances. And so the state gives us the authority to do that. And then we're kind of on our own as far as whether our definition would be supported by a court or not. But that's the legal team's job to kind of look at the case history and at what else is out there and make sure that we're not going too far in a definition or an enforcement role or anything like that, which is fairly straightforward and they do all the time.
All right. Thanks, Todd. All right.
Reb, does that mean that you'd have to reorient the approach a little bit, or
well, again,
how does what Todd said affect?
None of what I put in there was meant to suggest that that would be a component of a modified ordinance. It was simply to say that there's a lot of precedent. A lot of cities are dealing with this problem, and there seem to be, a handful of ways to write an ordinance to do it. I defer to Todd. If decibel levels are not the right way to do it, I would strike the second example, simply because he's got the experience to make that comment. So I wasn't suggesting down the line that those are provisions we should incorporate, rather to say there are a number of examples of how to do it out there that we could rely on, given the authority to explore these ordinance provisions.
Right. I mean, that's all we're allowed to do. We're allowed to say something needs to be improved. We've done enough homework to believe that that's possible, and we'd like city council to direct city manager to put the right set of people together to modify the language. And that right set of people is certainly going to be one or more members of this board, member of compliance, member of APD. If by a miracle suddenly the Loud Vehicle Association of America would step up and want to be part of that, they could be as well. I suspect they will stay silent on the topic. So that all has to go, any ordinance language ultimately has to go through the legal department before it can ever be incorporated in a future version of the ordinance. So we'll have to go through that whole path.
So just to make sure that I'm clear, the recommendation that we're looking to potentially put into the annual report is to recommend to City Council that it direct the city manager to empower the Noise Advisory Board to work with city staff on a revised ordinance. So we're not necessarily trying to have a written proposed revised ordinance before. Okay, cool. All right, that's great. So I think that's going to be completely doable and feasible. So, all right. Well, thanks. Any other questions or comments on the vehicle noise working group? Okay. Moving on to meeting frequency. So we're currently meeting quarterly. I think we've all talked about the fact that we feel like we need to meet in January. So working backwards, actually, let's just that seems something that's feasible enough to take a vote on from voting members. Let me just do a roll call and see. Rick, do you vote yay that we meet in January?
Okay.
Reb?
Yes.
Jeff?
Yes.
Carmelo?
Yes.
Liliana?
Yes.
David?
Yes.
Okay, and yes for me. So that passes unanimously. Haley, do you need anything? What do you need from us in regards to making sure that happens?
Well, I'll need a second on the motion that you made to meet in January.
Okay.
So who would like to second Jessica's motion?
I second it.
I'll second it.
Oop, got a few different seconds there. Who was my first?
Liliana.
Liliana, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. And then can we all agree that we'll just hold it at our normal date and time? So
Second Monday, 1 p.m. Yeah.
So that's
It'll be the
good.
9th. Is that right?
The 9th.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so that's good. So basically, we just need to decide now that if we're going to have January kick off our quarterly meetings for the year, or do you want to discuss a different meeting frequency?
Thoughts from the group?
So we got a lot more going on now than we did, even at the mid-year point. So I think it would be good, at least from my perspective, to try to just get back on the monthly cycle. And if, I can't remember for sure, but several of the people that we have lost who are no longer part of the board were some of the stronger voices for meeting less frequently because they didn't have time. So I figure with numerous new members, we'd really like to hear from them. That a once a month meeting plus whatever homework comes from any working group you're in is something you feel like you could actually accomplish.
I have a question. Are we going to continue to meet virtually?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm good with once a month, either that or once every other month, but once a month might be more easy to get it on a consistent schedule.
Haley, you were about to say something?
I was asking Rick if he'd like to bring a motion.
Oh,
Okay. Thanks for keeping us honest, Haley. So I move.
Can I ask a question first?
Well, wait a minute.
Sure.
She's trying to get us to conform to the rules. So, but the way this is supposed to work, which I always have to remind people and can,
Go
is
ahead.
a motion gets made. If there's no second, then there's no discussion because that means that there's no support for the motion.
Carry
If
on,
there's
carry
a second, then it's open to debate before vote. So I make a motion that we start in January and meet monthly until such time that the board feels that there is not enough work to continue to meet that frequently. If there's no second, then there's no vote to be had.
I second.
I have a question, but my fire alarm is going, so I might have to bail out.
I didn't hear you. Say it again.
He said his
He's got a fire alarm going on in his house.
Jeff, were you going to say something? You're muted.
I was just going to let Liliana know that his fire alarm was going off.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we have a motion. We have a second. Reb?
I don't know what the vote is, but yes, but I have to go.
Okay. Okay. Dave, yay or nay to meeting monthly?
Yeah.
Jeff?
Yay.
Carmelo?
Yay.
Yay for me too. So motion approved to meet monthly.
Yay,
Okay.
with the hope that we can run through everything faster if we're, tackling it more frequently.
Efficiently.
Yeah. Which I think we'll be able to do that. Okay, new business, moving on. So annual report and potential recommendations. So I think basically what we wanted to do is just make everyone aware of that, that's coming up. That's something that comes, basically Rick and I will be writing. We've already talked about the vehicle noise task force information and potentially including that in the annual report. It's essentially the not just potential recommendations, but it also lets City Council know what we've been working on or what our focus is going to be for 2023. So pretty much we just wanted to let everybody know to be thinking about that, based on these working groups and based on what we've been tackling so far this last year of information and what we're going to present. So you want to add anything to that, Rick?
No, that was right on target. I would say if any of the members thinks that there's a topic that we should be working toward that we've ignored, now would be a great time to tell us so we could figure out how to put that into the annual report.
Absolutely. Okay, next thing is new working groups. And so is there anybody who wants to propose a new working group of an area of focus for us? No?
Can you give us an example of what you mean by new working group? I mean, how many groups do we have?
So we currently have the vehicular noise group, and we have the decibel level working group, which is looking to, it's obviously going to expand with some of the work that we're talking about doing. So those are the two working groups that we have right now. There's, you'll see the next agenda item, for instance, is about that Rick's going to talk about is the downtown waste hauling. And so, for instance, that's something that could be a working group of if there is an issue or a concern, or even just to find more information about something, then that's essentially what would create a working group.
And Liliana, I don't really know whether you've been in any of these kinds of settings before, but working groups, Jeff and I, we can meet anytime we see fit. It doesn't have to wait for the next official meeting. We can't decide anything. All a working group can do is bring a recommendation to the board for a vote. So because of that, we can meet 17 times between now and the next meeting and do work at whatever pace we see fit. And it isn't subject to public. We don't have to set up a Zoom meeting. We don't have to have all that kind of stuff on. So that's where the work gets done on a topic that we'd get nowhere in a year if all we had was a 20-minute slice in each one of these meetings, right? So that's why you do it. Well, people are thinking, Todd, I think it was maybe before you were really in your leadership position with this, but there seemed to be a fair amount of angst about public space noise, just constraints on what compliance team can do. They can't ask a busker for ID or any of that. Is there anything that's really driving compliance crazy that you'd want us to form a working group on that we have not paid attention to?
No, I think you guys have identified the major issues that we're dealing with.
Okay.
The subjective standard in relation to residential communities compared to the objective standard in commercial properties, where those two meet, where they overlap, and vehicle noise. I think those are our two biggest concerns right now with the ordinance.
Okay. Good. That means we don't have more working groups to fill. We just can twist the arm of our volunteers to join up with the working groups that have a lot of work to do.
Fair enough. Okay, Rick, you want to talk about the downtown waste hauling?
Yeah, so this came up some time back, and notes from that time back said, this really needs to be driven by downtown residents. That, it's kind of not really a noise problem. It's not really something we can tackle on our own. So I reached out to downtown residents, the largest downtown residents association, and I got an earful of how long they have been trying to solve this problem and have essentially made no progress. Their perspective is that they were not treated well in the ordinance because prior to the ordinance, waste haul pickup could not begin till 6 a.m. and somehow it got moved back to 5 a.m. And so I'd like to work with them to draft a proposal to City Council that City Council form a task force outside of the noise ordinance to revisit the start time of waste haulers based on looking at successful efforts by other cities to have a more controlled approach to which waste hauler serves which business downtown. The problem, as I understand it, and I think as confirmed by downtown residents, is that let's say 6 businesses all have their waste containers in an alley. Well, they can hire 6 different waste haulers who have to fight and claw their way into that alley and be out of there before the pedestrian traffic picks up, because they're worried about accidents, because these are nasty trucks trying to get in and out of tight spaces. And essentially they convinced the city in the noise ordinance writing time that even at 6 o'clock, they were worried about hurting people. And I briefly read a study by New York, who faced this problem a few years ago. They had 90 different waste haulers serving downtown New York, and they basically took it all over and said, okay, you get this section, you get that section, you get that section, and then worked with them to set reasonable rates so that no business was getting an undue cost. So there are examples in the world on how to handle your downtown business district so that they can get in and out. And it won't carry hypothetically a large burden and cost on the businesses down there. But right now, nobody's trying to manage that. So task force that would contain residents, waste haulers, business leaders, and the sanitation staff would theoretically be able to come up with best practices and then put together a plan that would have a side effect of making a recommendation to the noise ordinance team that downtown waste hauling couldn't start until 7 a.m. or whatever was more appropriate. And our job would be, we're the only channel to get that whole task force started. So we would make that recommendation based on the complaints we have that 5 o'clock is just, is a problem for downtown residents. Carmelo.
I think that's a good model. And I know we talked about this during the summer as well. And I guess my one thought is to be as ahead of the curve as possible in anticipating any sort of frictions or hangups that might happen with this, because it would be kind of, a fairly significant reorientation for these waste management companies, even though the system totally makes sense. And I'm sure that if framed a certain way, such as you don't have to, if there's ever been a situation where there's two companies with two trucks literally in the same alley, corridor, or, tight situation, or they have to navigate around each other. I don't know if that has ever happened or whatever. But what I'm getting at is like dividing the city up into equal portions. Is it really feasible that we can do that in such a way that like the routes and workload are equally distributed? Otherwise, if it's not, and there's company A and B, just hypothetically, am I losing my signal? I have a bad connection. All right, the lag is really bad over here, but I can see you talking, but I can't hear you.
Carmelo, you're good. No,
Yeah, I'm not seeing it.
yeah, there's no lag and you haven't cut out at all. So
okay, your screens are all freezing and moving at different rates, so it's really it's a really wild scene over here. Okay, so yeah, if there's company A and there's company B, and the city divides it up, but the city's not a perfect grid or whatever, and if one company has a little, they have less routes, just barely by 5% less routes or pickups than they used to, and one company has 5% more or something like that. How might those companies react? I mean, does that mean that that will affect their business, their bottom line? No. And that it might be a naive question with some sort of simple solution, but this is a question that I thought of earlier because I really do like this solution. And if there's a way that it can be done, I think it totally makes sense to kind of like, it's managing traffic really, and managing the competition for any sort of like one company wanting to get into one alleyway early so they can beat the other companies there and not have to be stuck behind another truck or something that will block the road or what have you. I'm guessing this is why some of them start early as well sometimes. But yeah, I'm just thinking about like what it might actually look like if this good idea is proposed and these companies get the new map that says this is your district, this is your district. If there would be any such complications like that.
Well, sorry, I had audio problems for a while, so I lost a bunch, which is why I went out and came back in. That's the task force has a specific meaning to the city, and it's a cross-functional group of people who get together to solve a particular problem. And the waste haulers have to be there, the sanitation people have to be there, business leaders need to be there, and residents need to be there. When we discussed this going in to the first draft of the noise ordinance, we had no residents other than me, and I don't live downtown, in attendance with 3 waste haulers, a sanitation leader, and city staff. And the waste haulers, my recollection, they may deny it, they don't really love the system as it is, because hypothetically, these guys have to start at 5 o'clock. They sit around and wait for trucks to pull out so they can get into their dumpster. And so they're paying their guys a longer job. The response
That
from,
really is one of the issues then. They actually are like literally waiting behind another company sometimes.
That's my understanding. The response from sanitation, which is often the case when city staff is always under the gun for 1,000 things, was, we need to hire somebody to go figure this out. And my response to the downtown residents are roll up your sleeves and offer some elbow grease to help try to figure this out. Otherwise, you're going to be waiting for 4 budget cycles before the city comes up with enough money to hire a person to do it, right? Just go do the homework. I mean, that's what volunteer organizations do when they work for the city, is they give their personal time to a topic that they're eager to get solved, and see if they can bring a solution to the table that doesn't require a whole new full-time employee who hypothetically would put this new system in place and then have no work to do thereafter except to keep an eye on it. So it could fail. It could completely fail, right? The waste haulers could decide not to attend. City staff could throw up their arms and say, I can't even afford to put anybody on this task force. But the downtown residents who feel pain from this don't have any other channel. And they've been trying for a long time to get somebody to pay attention to them. And since we're the owners of the 5 o'clock start time, it seems logical that we'd make the recommendation to put people together, however many months it takes to figure this out, to read the report from New York and other places that do this. It could have all those problems that I think you were outlining, Carmelo, and in which case the task force would fail, but at least the residents for downtown would feel they had a voice in it, and maybe they learned something.
Well, would it make sense then for someone to reach out to some of these companies and get to feel the room, so to say, as to like, would they be amicable to sitting at the table together and discussing what a potential solution like this might look like, and looking at it from, you know, the most beneficial to the companies. It's not just going to benefit the people. So in a way that, you know, their garbage isn't going to be being picked up at 5 a.m., but also framed to the companies in such a way that's like, hey, we know that you guys have been waiting around. Like, has this really been an issue, being stuck behind the other companies, XYZ? Like, would you be, you know, agreeable to sitting at a table and discussing some options with us in the city?
So, I can't take on the lead of another working group inside the Noise Advisory Board. So I can't be that person. B, I felt that the direction the Noise Advisory Board gave when we talked about this first time was let the residents lead. And so I went and tried to make that happen. And they basically threw up their hands and say, we've been trying, we need help. And C, this would just put it on the radar of city council, and they'd have to say yay or nay. And that then the downtown residents and the waste haulers have all the opportunity in the world to go and give public input at that point in time, rather than making it my work or your work, Carmelo, or that sort of thing. Because it's certainly a stretch for someone appointed to a noise board to get into the precise scheduling of the number of slots in an alley and that sort of thing. So that's what led me to this. If we don't even think we should make the recommendation, then it'll be in the minutes, and I will just tell the residents that I had worked with that we still think task force is a good idea, but you're going to have to go raise that yourself with city council. Those are the only two ways I know how to proceed. All the questions you've asked are good ones. But that's the purpose of task force, is to peel back the onion on that sort of thing and find out if what I recall from a 1 hour meeting with 3 waste haulers and a sanitation leader, whether I have communicated that effectively and correctly.
Well, in that case, the order of operations makes sense to me.
Cool. So I think from my perspective, Jessica, I don't know if a motion is due because I don't have anything tangible other than a notion to present, but I will draft a resolution language far enough in advance of the next meeting in January to have that out there for the team to review to see if that's appropriate. And if that creates a bunch of more conversation, it doesn't necessarily have to be in as a resolution in the annual report, just as an area that we're trying to come up with a resolution on.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, moving on. We're going to move on to public comment. And so I will ask Haley, is there anybody on the line for public comment?
We do have somebody on the line. Let's see if they'd like to make public comment. Caller on the line, if you'd like to make public comment, please tap *3 now to enter the speaker queue. Okay, they are not entering the speaker queue, so I think we are okay. We did receive some comments that I emailed over to you all prior to the meeting. It is up to you if you'd like to read those aloud now, or we could just discuss, summarize what the comments said.
Did everybody have an opportunity to read the public comments that came in? Yeah. Okay. Rick, do you want me to read them aloud?
I don't care. I feel like we tackled the one that talked about bass in the decibel discussion, so I don't personally feel that one needs to be read. The other one posed a lot of questions about types of noise and repetitive noise and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
We don't specifically have a working group or anybody looking at that, so I don't know if that's enough of an issue to take anywhere.
Yeah, I really, it's and for those that did send information in, send in public comment, we do appreciate it. This, again, the one that you're talking about that has so many different points to it, really does just illustrate the, just the subjectiveness of it, right? Of what we deal with, is because it's like, first thing is bands, above 75, 65 are rarely noise. Why? They don't disturb. But then goes on to say anything permitted by the city should not be noise. Fireworks parades, the city should probably state in their letters when they approve performances. But then goes on to say drums played for even hours at 50 dB really are noise. Buskers without amplification rarely are noise. A rapper saying inane things to those passed by using an amp for 3 or 4 hours under 65 dBA is certainly noise. I mean, I think this person basically illustrates the challenges that we have. Freedom of religion really does not mean that they can be loud and disturbing. But also, one of the things that we talked about earlier is somebody mentioned this same person mentioned the signs in Greenville, South Carolina, discouraging noise. I know that's one of the things that we brought up and talked about in the past. I know Reb brought that up about some of the billboards and signs, and that's possibly some of the things we'll be looking to put in our recommendation. So yeah, I mean, I think that this brings up a lot of good points. Enforcement is a very tough job. I hope you give them the tools they need and a workable process. And then, of course, brings up vehicle noise, which is something else that we've already talked about. And and about the muffler. So hopefully we'll be getting to some sort of, we'll hopefully have that recommendation sooner than later for City Council. Any comments on that public comment or the other public comment that we got? That we brought up about the base with Market Street?
No, but I just wanted to say I'm terribly sorry, but I have to leave. It's after 9:30 over here, and there's a snowstorm outside, and I have to walk a little bit to get back to my own apartment. And terribly sorry for leaving early, but I'll be back in Asheville and in your time zone early January. So I will see you all then. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carmelo.
Thanks, Carmelo.
Ciao.
Wow.
So any questions or comments about the public comment that we've received? No? Okay, if not,
I think
Oh.
the extensive one of all of the different aspects of noise is very interesting, and I think it is relevant to the problems we have in trying to decide, is it a personal decision, or is it a noise, or is it a quality of life? It's a big issue, and it's confusing to me, even on this board. How do we address all of that? I don't know. I don't know if there's a good way of doing that.
yeah, I mean, and that's part of what we've, I think it's one of the things that we continue to just keep in mind as we're trying to, obviously we're trying to come up with answers of things that are going to best suit the community, right? And as many aspects. But I don't ever want us to lose sight on the fact that this is a difficult subject to tackle because of that. I mean, even seeing that from some of the complainants' responses from the surveys that Rick and Jeff did, where folks were like, it seems like it's gotten better, but I'm not sure. And, I think they've done some things or maybe not. And that was, that was one of the comments in that somebody had made. And I was like, that's a good question. Did the business do something, or is it just different circumstantial evidence? And some of it, that could be anything from like personal surroundings to, whatever somebody's going through, to time of year, all those things that we've talked about. So, I think that we're doing our best to make strides, and we'll continue to do our best, but it's just important to remember that this person clearly stated that it's a lot to figure out. So, and especially a first time board.
So, it is really hard. I feel like I'm missing something that I can't really put my finger on. And don't mistake what I'm about to say. I am not advocating for more decibel limits on other things. But I keep on asking myself, so as I read this, many of the things that this writer wrote, this is noise, even though it's below a certain one. Some of them are in public space, and as such, they're governed by the nuisance part of the ordinance, which leaves it to the discretion of the compliance organization to assess whether it's noise or not. And I find myself asking myself, how well is that going? How many busker complaints or Pack Square megaphone complaints or whatever those are that fit that, how many of them have there been? What's the experience of the compliance team in trying to apply a subjective part to it? And who or how would anybody look at the detail around that interaction and reach conclusion on whether it's effective or ineffective? And we don't ever talk about that. And that's at least partially because we've got other stuff on our plates here that we're trying to get figured out. But it's also because that the notes taken by the compliance team, and please, Todd, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, were not intended for public consumption. They name names, they do things that the city staff is rightfully concerned would violate privacy regulations or put people in an awkward spot or that sort of thing. So how could we ever, as a board, learn how this is going? I don't know, because nothing comes to the table. And you know, so I can't make a recommendation here other than to break down these things at some point and say this is public space stuff and it's supposed to be dealt with in the nuisance part of the thing, and we need help from the compliance team telling us what the barriers are or why this complainant was convinced this was noise, and yet when the compliance person witnessed it and made the subjective decision, they said that's not noise. We have anecdotal, right? I remember Daniel saying that one complainant complained because the singer was off key. And it's his judgment at that moment that that's not a reasonable complaint. We can't make any recommendations or build a working group or anything like that around one example like that. So I don't know, maybe in a future meeting, we could try to figure out a better way for the board to be aware of the challenge and be aware of how frequently a complaint yields an action with where somebody's warned, or that the judgment is it's not noise, right? I don't know. I hope that makes sense to the board, that I don't really feel we have data that would help us take action at this point in time on that.
Yeah, it makes sense, Rick. It's public space, especially. It's kind of what this person is getting to is like, you know, looking at loudness versus duration versus all of these different things. Reb, you have...
He references the Busker Collective.
Mm-hmm.
Would the Busker community support making the Busker Collective turn into ordinance language? I have no idea.
I don't know.
Would that does the compliance team even know what the Busker Collective calls for? And has anybody ever asked them to apply it to the public space stuff to see if it, I don't know. I feel like I'm just babbling. Sorry.
It's a good question. And I think maybe what we look at is maybe that's some future business, right? That we look at tackling public space and looking at some of those questions. And also seems like something that we'd need to probably get Daniel's more involved in having that conversation. Because like you were saying, is like, what are the challenges that they're facing? And where is it as a compliance, you know, for us and the Noise Advisory Board, where we could show support and be able to be helpful. So, because right now it just feels like a very big thing to tackle while we have these other things that we've identified of vehicle noise and the decibel levels that we're working with right now. Reb, I'm sorry, you've had your hand up and.
It's okay. Really, I put it up after the remarks that Liliana made about the note that pointed out the dimensions and complexity of noise and what the common denominator of all that is, which makes me think that we should all, if not having done so already, read the guidelines for community noise by the World Health Organization. It is the single most comprehensive document that I've ever read that summarizes what it all means, what's the work about when it comes to community noise. And I just can't recommend it highly enough. Haley, I've got a copy. I'd be willing to send it to you. It's a PDF format. And I just think it would be great reading for everybody.
If you want to send that to me, I'll be happy to push it out to the group.
Sure.
Thank you for that information. Anything else? Anything else anybody from the board wants to add before I make a motion to adjourn? Jeff, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick note. I mean, as we talk about how complex this is, and I think it was part of what Rick was saying before too. It's such a complex thing for the enforcement team to have to deal with. So I just wanted to say I appreciate the efforts of them being out there trying to figure out and navigate this. I know it's complicated, and I know what our job is to do is to figure out a way to support what happens there as well. So I just want to say thanks to that.
Good point. Okay, anything else? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, I would like to make a motion to adjourn this meeting.
Second.
So if there's no objections, we actually don't need to make a motion to adjourn. We can just see if
Alright.
there's any objections to adjourn.
Sounds good. Sorry, y'all. I'm a little out of practice, you know?
Okay. It's understandable. We don't meet every month, but we're going to.
We are. Okay, our next meeting will be on January 9th at 12:45. We'll join. And that's it. So thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate y'all.
Everyone, happy holidays.
Could I ask everyone?
Happy
to
holidays.
hold
Nice
on
to
for a
meet you,
second?
Dave.
Mary.
Yeah, Todd, what's up?
Oh.
Haley, will you turn off the public access?
1 second.
Do we need to stay or can we go?